Sade was born in a small village where life was hard, but dreams were big. Her parents, Papa Sade and Mama Sade, were poor farmers who worked from sunrise to sunset, toiling under the scorching sun to provide food for their family. Their farm, a small piece of land behind their mud house, produced just enough maize, yams, and vegetables to feed them. Some seasons were good, but others were harsh, with little rain and dry soil that made farming difficult. Despite their struggles, Papa Sade and Mama Sade believed in the power of education. They had never gone to school themselves, but they knew it was the only way for their daughter to have a better future. "My daughter," Mama Sade would say, wiping sweat from her forehead after a long day in the fields, "if you study hard, you will not suffer like us. One day, you will take this family out of this struggle." Those words became Sade's motivation, pushing her to dream beyond the dusty village roads. The village was small, with just a few rows of mud houses and thatched roofs. Children played in the open fields, running barefoot on the warm earth, while women gathered under big trees to share stories as they pounded yam or roasted corn. The only school in the village was a long walk away, and Sade made the journey every day, carrying her books tightly against her chest. Even when her stomach was empty, she sat in class, listening to every word her teacher said. She loved to learn, and her dream was to become a nurse, to help the sick, especially the elderly women and children who often fell ill due to poor medical care in the village. But school was expensive, and her parents struggled to pay the fees. Some months, they had to sell extra farm produce, or Papa Sade had to take on extra labor in the market, lifting heavy sacks of grain for traders. Still, it was never enough. There were days Sade had to stay home because they couldn't afford her fees. Other times, she borrowed books from friends because she couldn't afford her own. Yet, she never gave up. Then, one day, something amazing happened. A scholarship was announced for the best students in the village. The government was looking for smart children to sponsor in the city, where they would get better education and opportunities. It was a rare chance, and Sade knew she had to give it her all. Every night, under the dim glow of the small lantern her mother gave her, she studied harder than ever. Her heart raced with hope. This was her chance, her only chance, to change not just her life, but her family's future. Her parents were overjoyed. "This is God's blessing," Papa Sade said, holding her hands. They sold some of their farm produce to buy her a small bag and a pair of new sandals. "Sade, you are our hope. Don't forget where you come from," Mama Sade whispered, tears in her eyes. As she sat in the bus going to the city, Sade waved at her parents until they disappeared in the distance. She was excited but also scared. The city was big, and she was just a village girl. Could she survive? Would she really change her family's life? She held her bag tightly and made a promise to herself, "No matter what happens, I will not fail." When Sade arrived in the city, she was shocked. Everywhere was noisy. Cars moved fast, people walked quickly, and everyone seemed too busy to notice her. The buildings were tall, and the streets were wide. Everything was different from her small village. She found a small room in a crowded area, sharing it with two other students. The room was small and hot, but she had no choice. Her scholarship paid for her school fees, but it did not cover food, books, or rent. She had to find a way to survive. After school, she looked for jobs. She washed clothes, helped women in the market, and even cleaned offices. The work was hard, but it gave her enough money to buy food. Some nights, she ate only bread and water, but she never complained. She kept telling herself, "This is only for a while. One day, things will be better." One day, while searching for work, she saw a big restaurant with a sign that said, "Waitresses needed." The restaurant was beautiful, with glass doors and bright lights. She decided to apply. The manager looked at her small body and asked, "Can you handle the work?" Sade nodded. She needed this job. The work was not easy. She was always on her feet, serving rich people who barely noticed her. Men in fine suits, women in expensive dresses, all laughing and eating while she struggled. She told herself, "One day, I will not serve food. I will come here as a guest." But she had no idea that the night that would change her life forever was coming soon. One evening, the restaurant was very busy. People were ordering food, laughing, and drinking. Sade moved from table to table, so also her other colleagues, her legs aching with every step. She had been working since morning, and she was exhausted. "Table 5 needs a drink," her manager called. She picked up a tray and walked to the table. A man was sitting alone, dressed in a fine suit. His name was Io. He had a gold watch and a serious face. He looked up at her and said, "Bring me something strong." She quickly returned with a glass of wine. As she poured it, he looked at her and said, "You look tired." Sade was surprised. No customer had ever spoken to her like that before. "I work hard," she said simply. "Life is not easy." Io smiled. "I understand. Life is not fair to everyone," he said. Then he did something unexpected. "Sit for a moment," he said. "You look like you need a rest." Sade knew it was against the rules, but for the first time, someone was kind to her. She sat down, just for a minute. She did not know that this small mistake would change her life forever. Io was different from other customers. He was not just rich, he was also friendly. He asked Sade about her dreams, her struggles, and he listened to her like he cared. He told her about his own life, about how money did not always bring happiness. As they talked, he called the waiter and ordered a sweet drink. "Taste this," he said. Sade shook her head. "No, I don't drink." "Just one sip," Io said, smiling. "It won't hurt." She hesitated, then took the glass. The drink was sweet at first, then it burned her throat. She coughed, and Io laughed. "Not bad, right?" he said. Sade nodded. "Not bad, but I won't try that again." They laughed over it and went their separate ways. She felt tipsy but managed to get home. And she promised herself she will not do that again. Days turned into weeks, and Sade focused on school and work. She never called Io, and she tried to forget about him. But one evening, as she was serving food at the restaurant, she saw him again. This time, he was sitting alone at a corner table, staring at his phone. Sade wanted to avoid him, but her manager called her. "Sade, take the order at table 3. Her heart skipped a beat. Table 3 was where Io sat. She walked over, trying to act normal. "Good evening, sir. What would you like to order?" she asked politely. Io looked up and smiled. "Sade. It's nice to see you again." He placed his phone down. "Surprise me. Order anything you think I will like." Sade hesitated. "Sir, I don't." "Io," he corrected. "Call me Io. And just pick something for me." She nodded and quickly left to place the order. As she waited for the food, she couldn't help but wonder why Io was being so friendly. Most rich customers never even looked at waitresses, but Io was different. She knew she had to be careful, but something about him made her curious. After finishing his meal, Io stayed at the restaurant, watching Sade as she worked. When she had a free moment, he waved her over. You work too much, he said. Do you ever take a break? Sade smiled a little. I don't have a choice. I have school fees to pay. Io nodded, then leaned forward. How about this? Let me take you out to dinner one day. No work, no stress. Just a good meal. Sade's heart raced. She knew the right answer was no, but a part of her was tempted. She had not had a proper meal in weeks, and she was tired of struggling. But she also remembered her promise to herself, not to get distracted. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think it's a good idea, she said finally. Io smiled, as if he had expected that answer. All right. But if you ever change your mind, let me know. He stood up, placed some money on the table, and left. Sade sighed. She had done the right thing. But why did she feel like something inside her wanted to say yes? One evening, Sade was coming back from work when it started to rain heavily. She didn't have an umbrella, and by the time she got to her hostel, she was completely soaked. She sneezed, shivering from the cold. That night, her body felt weak. Her head was hot, and her throat was sore. She had a fever. She tried to rest, but her body ached all over. The next morning, she was too sick to go to work. She lay in bed, wrapped in a blanket, thinking about how she would lose her job if she missed too many days. Just then, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She picked up slowly. Sade. The voice was deep, familiar. It was Io. Her heart skipped. How did you get my number? She asked weakly. I asked your manager. He said you didn't come to work today. Are you okay? Sade hesitated. She didn't want to sound weak, but she was too tired to lie. I'm sick. There was silence for a moment. Then Io said, Where do you live? I'll bring you something to eat. Sade almost refused, but her stomach growled. She had not eaten since the day before. Finally, she whispered her address. That decision would change everything. An hour later, there was a knock on the door. Sade slowly got up and opened it. Io stood there, holding a bag of food. He looked around the small, cramped room and frowned. Is this where you live? Sade felt embarrassed. It's all I can afford. Io sighed and handed her the food. Sit down. Eat first. Sade hesitated but took the food. As she ate, Io sat beside her, watching. Why do you make life so hard for yourself? He asked. I could help you. You don't have to suffer like this. Sade looked up. I don't take handouts. Io shook his head. It's not a handout. It's help. I respect your hard work, but even strong people need support sometimes. Sade didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. She finished eating, and before she knew it, she started feeling lightheaded. Her body was too weak from the fever. You need rest, Io said. Lie down. Sade nodded slowly and lay on the bed. She felt warm, safe. As her eyes closed, she felt Io's hand gently covering hers. That was the last thing she remembered. The next morning, when she woke up, she was alone. Io was gone. But something inside her felt different. Weeks passed, and life went back to normal. Sade returned to work, avoiding Io whenever he came to the restaurant. She was afraid of how he made her feel. She wanted to focus on school. But soon, she started feeling strange. She was always tired. She felt dizzy in the mornings. The smell of food made her nauseous. One afternoon, as she was walking home, she felt a sharp pain in her stomach and nearly collapsed. A woman nearby helped her sit down. "My dear, you don't look well. Are you pregnant?" Sade's breath caught. "No, that's not possible," she whispered. But deep inside, fear gripped her heart. That evening, she bought a pregnancy test. She sat in the small bathroom, hands shaking as she waited for the result. When she looked at it, her vision blurred with tears. It was positive. Sade could not sleep that night. She kept staring at the test, hoping it would change. But the truth was clear: she was carrying a child. Io's child. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered, holding her stomach. She thought about her parents. What would Papa Sade and Mama Sade say? Would they disown her? She thought about school. Would she have to drop out? What about her dreams? She thought about Io. Should she tell him? Would he even believe her? Tears rolled down her face. She had worked so hard to build a future, and now it was slipping away. She had no idea what to do. Sade knew she couldn't keep the secret forever. She had to tell Io. But how? Would he believe her? Would he accept the child? For days, she avoided him. But one evening, as she was closing at the restaurant, Io walked in. He looked at her, his face serious. "Sade, we need to talk." Her heart pounded. She knew this moment had come. She took a deep breath and nodded. They sat at an empty table, and Io leaned forward. "You've been avoiding me." "Why?" Sade's hands trembled. She looked into his eyes and whispered, "I'm pregnant." Silence. The air felt heavy. Io's face changed. He blinked, then sat back slowly. "What?" Sade's eyes filled with tears. "The baby is yours, Io." For the first time, Io was speechless. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the table. "How do you know it's mine?" he finally asked. Sade felt a stab of pain in her chest. "Because you were the only man I have ever been with." Io exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. This is a lot." Sade swallowed hard. "I don't expect anything from you, Io. I just thought you should know." Then, she stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked out before he could say another word. For weeks, Io did not contact Sade. She took it as a sign that he didn't want anything to do with her or the baby. Her heart broke, but she had to be strong. She told her parents the truth. Papa Sade was furious. He refused to speak to her for days. "You have disgraced this family," he shouted. But Mama Sade held her daughter and whispered, "No matter what, you are still my child." Sade's life became harder. She struggled to work, study, and prepare for the baby. She had no savings, and she didn't know how she would survive. Then, one evening, as she was locking the restaurant door, a car pulled up. It was Io. He stepped out, looking nervous. "Sade, I'm sorry," he said. "I needed time to think." Sade folded her arms. "And? What did you decide?" Io sighed. "I can't walk away from my child. I want to be there. I want to help you." Tears filled Sade's eyes. "I don't need pity, Io." Io shook his head. "This is not pity. I made a mistake, and I want to fix it. I want to support you and our baby." For the first time in a long while, Sade felt relief. Maybe things wouldn't be as bad as she thought. Maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to do this alone. 9 months later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. She named him Abidemi, I am my junior, meaning my joy has returned. Io was there at the hospital, holding her hand. I promise to be a good father, he whispered. Sade looked at her son, then at Io. She had been through so much pain, so much fear. But now, looking at her baby, she realized something. She was not alone anymore. Io assisted Sade back to school, and then she graduated from the university, and they finally got married, and lives happily ever after. The end. Moral lessons from the story. 1. One mistake can change your life forever. Sade never planned for pregnancy, but one mistake changed her future. 2. Life is unpredictable, but we must face it with strength. Sade had to survive despite being abandoned and struggling alone. 3. Not everyone will stand by you, but real love will find a way. Io took time to realize his responsibility, but in the end, he stood by his child. If you have enjoyed this story, leave us a comment, let us know what lessons you learnt from this story. Give us a like and share to friends and family. If you have not subscribed to our channel, please do, and don't forget to hit the notification button, so you will be the first to be notified when we put up a new story. Thank you for listening. See you in our next story.